this some kind of limit on, but it worked once. This is so annoying. No, I can't even ask chat. It's saying log in. Whatever. Let me, actually, maybe will it let me log in? Yeah, here we go. Sorry, but I really want to record this. I'm not even going to say the same thing I did last time. I changed my mind about some stuff. I have to be able to record. Ugh. It's not filling in the password. All right, I don't know what to do. Okay, on I go. What was I saying before that happened? Lawgiver, right. So this is where Locke invokes like divine reward and punishment. Locke doesn't think that that would be a complete answer to these two questions. How do I know he doesn't think that? Because he thinks that the civil law and the law of virtue, for the most part, track the divine law. So the divine law is the true law of morality. It's the true law of morality according to Locke, just because divine reward and punishment overrides any other reward and punishments. Right? You remember that. So, but he says, for the most part, the civil law, that is the law that's enforced by the state, and the law of virtue, that is the law that's imposed by the approval or disapproval of your club, like of your society, right? He says, for the most part, those track the divine law. Why? Because the divine law the divine law prescribes exactly what is socially useful. And so, of course, people approve of what's socially useful. Right? So although it's true that, there's a piece missing there that we can't show without the divine reward and punishment, we can't really show that you should do these things that people approve of. Locke agrees that people already approve of what's socially useful, even if they don't know about the divine law. Right, so even, right, like ancient pagans or whatever, they mostly agree about what's virtuous and what isn't. He says they'll give a different definition of it, they give a different explanation of why you should do it, and what he calls the Christian one, right? Although there's nothing specifically Christian as opposed to some other religion about it, right? But it's the Christian answer is the right answer. I mean, because again, Locke thinks I'm always going to do what I think gets the most pleasure for myself, and without believing that there's like some mechanism that always makes sure that that lines up with the moral law, I can't be guaranteed that I'll always be motivated to be moral. But but Locke admits that that the ancients and Hobbes can give you a pretty good reason for being moral. But like what all three of those are dealing with together basically is like the question gets asked in the first place because people already approve, for the most part, of what's socially useful. All right, so in any case, so even Locke doesn't think that the divine reward and punishment part answers these questions, right? It's not that social utility pleases us to begin with because we know that will be rewarded by God. Because even people who don't know or don't believe that they're going to be rewarded by God, for the most part, approve of virtue and disapprove of vice. So, and clearly, Hume agrees that it doesn't give an answer to this, but when he addresses this question, he doesn't even mention it. Right? He doesn't even mention that as a possible answer to it. So, you can see why Hume looks like an atheist to someone reading this, right? If in some sense, in some way, he's not an atheist, that's, I think there's some ambiguity about that, but it's pretty clear that he doesn't think religion is a good basis for morality. So, okay, so I guess, I hope I'm going to come back at the end and talk in more detail about what Hume's answer is going to be. But in case I don't, I'll just say, so first of all, it seems at first blush then that Hume thinks that although other things motivate us to act, recommendations have to be based on self-interest. Now, why would he think that? I think maybe it would be clear if you said something like, recommendations in good faith have to be based on self-interest. Recommendations, roughly speaking, like consistent with what we're recommending. Right? Like, it's not virtuous to give people advice that will go against their interests. If you're in a position of authority, you can give them commands that go against their interests, but it's not virtuous to give them advice that goes against their interests. So if you recommend virtue, but you do it in a way that doesn't show people how it aligns with their interests, then you yourself are not being virtuous. You're being kind of sneaky somehow, right? And Hume is arguing here, or at least, this whole section is like what's going on here is it's difficult to be sure. it begins with the reflection that if there were to be a system of morality that couldn't be used to recommend virtue, then that system of morality would be socially pernicious, right? Because you'd be teaching people like why they shouldn't do what's socially useful necessarily. And that wouldn't be socially useful. And so, since people blame what is not socially useful, they will blame your system. And right, and so Hume says, even if people can't figure out how to refute it, they'll make sure to bury it in oblivion. Right. So, like, when someone begins a section with that reflection, then obviously you have to worry, so, I mean, of course, you could fix that by convincing people that your system is not socially pernicious. Even if it is, you could fix the problem by convincing them that it's not. Then they won't know that they have to bury it in oblivion, and you will get your fame, and your books will sell, and you'll be in good shape, right? So, but in any case, at least on the surface, what Hume is arguing here is that you don't have to be sneaky. You can you can recommend morality with a good conscience, right? This is opposed to what Nietzsche is going to say later, that morality undermines itself by way of the virtue of intellectual conscience or intellectual honesty. Because that's part of what it commands, and yet intellectual honesty exposes its basis. At least that's something Nietzsche says in some places. Nietzsche obviously is even trickier than Hume to figure out what he's actually doing and why. Yeah, anyway. Okay. So anyway, that's what's going on, except there's a weird twist. And the twist is that Hume's answer goes by way of asking what self-interest actually is. What is our self-interest? And arguing that we mostly don't think about that right. Unlike Locke's answer says, you're right, your self-interest is to get pleasure, and but it so happens that there's someone who's going to give you lots of pleasure if you do this, and lots of pain if you don't. Whereas Hume is saying it's more like Plato or Descartes at this point, saying hold on, are you so sure what's good to achieve? Right. So, I mean, pleasure is still there, but anyway, like I said, hopefully I'll get to those details later. Are there questions before I go to say more about section 5? That was just a summary of the reading overall. Okay. Okay, so in section 5, Hume discusses, I think, 3 different possible answers to this question, why does utility please? So the first answer is education. And the second answer is that the selfish principle is right, but we really do approve of utility because of self-interest. Now, I mean, notice this is not, here we're not asking the question of why we act morally when we do, or why we should, or how it can be recommended. We're asking why we approve of it. And he's saying that one alternative he's considering is we approve of it because of our self-interest, because of the way we in general approve of things that are good for us. And the last answer is humanity, as he calls it, right? That is our tendency to be pleased by the pleasure of others and to be rendered uneasy by their pain. Right, so the education theory is that this system of praise and blame, because it's socially useful, and not just socially useful in the way, like, I don't know, a better kind of eraser would be socially useful because it would make our society better or something like that. Right, if I told that joke in this class about what they thought the cheapest department in the university was the math department. No, I haven't. They thought the cheapest department in the university was the math department because all they need is a pencil, paper, and an eraser. But then they realized the philosophy department is cheaper because they don't need the eraser. Right. Anyway, and I told that joke to a mathematician once, and he was really offended because he thought I meant that philosophers never make any mistakes, so we don't need an eraser. All right. Anyway, so right. So not just socially useful in that way, but like the very basis of society. Right? Like the possibility of people living together depends on this. And therefore, the theory is that crafty politicians, meaning, by politicians meaning like people whose business it is to establish political societies, right? Not like people who are running for office. Right? So crafty politicians instituted this system of praise and blame in order to get society going. Right? They were like, well, I want to start this society and it's not going to work unless people follow these rules. So I'm going to educate them. I'm going to convince them to praise these things that are socially useful and blame these things that aren't. And I mean, actually, going back to Locke, if you ask Locke the question, so again, not the question of how would you recommend morality, but the question of why do people generally approve of morality? Locke's apparent answer is not that different from this. I mean, he's not concentrating on politicians, he's just thinking about anyone in general. But this is what he says: God having, by an inseparable connection, this is in the essay, Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 6. God having, by an inseparable connection, joined virtue and public happiness together, and made the practice thereof necessary to the preservation of society, and visibly beneficial to all with whom the virtuous man has to do. So God having made it, I mean, this passage taken out of context makes it sound like Locke is a voluntarist about morality, like God arbitrarily created some moral rules and then arranged the laws of nature so that following those rules would be beneficial to society, right? But I don't think that's what Locke actually thinks. If you compare what he says other places, he really thinks it's the other way around, right? You can, if you want to know what God thinks is virtuous, look and see what's good for society, because that's obviously what God would think was virtuous, right? So anyway, right, because on this way, we would have a hard time being sure, like, how do we know? Well, anyway, never mind. So that's God having, just because virtue and the public happiness are inseparably joined, it is no wonder that everyone should not only allow, but recommend and magnify those rules to others from whose observance of them he is sure to reap advantage to himself. He may, out of interest as well as conviction, cry up that for sacred which, if once trampled on and profaned, he himself cannot be safe or secure. So, I mean, you might think this sounds like a self-interest answer, but it's not exactly. It's because the person who's saying this doesn't necessarily themselves approve of virtue. There's another passage, it wasn't part of the assigned reading, where Locke says this even more explicitly. Right? He says, you know, even if you don't obey the moral law yourself, you would have taken leave of your senses if you started recommending to other people that they not obey it. Because that's going to be bad for you, right? So it's best for me if everyone else obeys the law of morality. And if there's going to be an exception, it should be just me, right? So, and I think that's the same thing Locke is saying here. He's saying that, like, whatever people themselves think about virtue, of course they're going to publicly praise it. Because anyone can see that it's good for them if people are virtuous. So that's pretty much the right? And then, of course, what I'm hoping is that everyone else will, you know, will join in sincerely praising virtue and will become virtuous, and that will be good for me, right? So it's very much like those crafty politicians, I think, who don't themselves necessarily feel any obligation to be virtuous, but they want to get everyone else to act virtuous. So, should I talk about the argument against that first? The argument against that is long. So actually, I'm going to go through these two first and then come back to Hume's argument against this. So this one says, you know, like the way it basically goes, at least the version of it that Hume gives is, this is on page 40. As every man has a strong connection with society and perceives the impossibility of his solitary subsistence, he becomes on that account favorable to all those habits or principles which promote order in society. Right? So this means that I myself start approving of virtue because I see how good virtue is for society, and I realize that I depend on society for my subsistence. I mean, the difference is subtle here, but it's important in terms of like what kind of objections you can make to it, and what kind of arguments you can make on behalf of it, or how the argument would have to work. Like, so here you have to work out that that virtuous action actually pleases me, and vicious action displeases me. Like for the same reason that if I like grapes, grapes please me. Right? It's in my grapes are a good thing for me because they cause me pleasure. That's what I like about virtue too. Now, I mean, of course, in the case of grapes, it's like there isn't an issue about whether I myself will be grapes, right? Because we're not talking about people, but here, so if this worked, it would have to be something that would get me to approve of virtue in myself because of self-interest. So, I mean, that could provide a strong argument against this, right? And Hume takes up an objection like this in section 9. I mean, it's pretty, call it an objection, it's pretty obvious, right? The question would be, like, isn't the first guy we were talking about right? The person who said, what's good for me is that everyone else is virtuous and not me. Right. So, but Hume disposes of this more easily than that, I think, by his usual argument about the way I praise and blame virtue in ancient societies or in my enemies or whatever, in cases where, because again, like this would seem to indicate that it's my society that counts. That's the one where it's in my best interest for people to be virtuous. But that's not what social utility means in this context. It means the society of the person I'm talking about. And this connection of my interests with the interests of society can't help with that, because there's no connection with my interests and interests of some other society. All right, so I mean, that's going to leave this one. I mean, in a way, Hume says basically, like, the burden of proof really should be on any other answer. Oh, did you have a question?
Yeah, I would be curious to hear a little bit more why Hume holds this view that there's no connection between the interests of some other society and my interests. I mean, like, Bronze Age Egypt flourishing indirectly helps me flourish. But does Hume retain that notion?
Well, I mean, so first of all, Hume discusses stronger cases where the society we're talking about is the enemy society, right? And so, like, for them to have courageous people or whatever is bad for my interests, and yet I still give my moral approval. Or if I tend not to, then everyone, including me, will, if I'm self-aware, will agree that I have a certain bias, right? Like I have a tendency to attribute moral evil to these people because they're my enemies, so it distorts my judgment. So I mean, that is, we all seemingly agree that the right standard is one that would correct for that difference. And on this self-interest view, it's unintelligible why that would be looked on as a correction. As far as the ancient societies, yeah, I guess I think Hume believes that it's hard to tell at this distance whether some particular person in ancient times was, like, what they did was good for my interests or bad for my interests. But even if, you can make an argument that at least certain ancient societies, if they had met with a calamity, I wouldn't be here, right? But on the other hand, you can say that, like, maybe if they had done much better than they did, I also wouldn't be here. Right? So, I think, thinking about it more, I think Hume is right to say it's really hard for us to say what in ancient times serves our best interest. All right. So, I'm doing this in a weird order. It's not too confusing. It's not the order I wrote it down in my notes either, which I should have followed, but oh well. Because I basically discussed this and the argument against this, and I start discussing this, then I want to go back to the argument against this. But I'll just say that Hume thinks that, like, in some sense, the obvious explanation why we approve of social utility would be that we're pleased by things that please other people, and so so when we think about someone, we think about their tendency to please other people, which means like primarily the people right around them. Right, like that's where their tendency to please other people comes out. Not to directly please them. That's one of the other principles, right? But here we're talking about not to directly please them, but to do things which cause them pleasure in the long run. That is to be useful. So he says it's just like if we see a picture of a pleasant country with, fertile country with fruits and grain or whatever, that's pleasing. It's not even a real country, but it's pleasing because it's like the idea of something that would please people if they were there. Yeah.
If he's cognizant of like the pleasing of the people around the person, and is there any concept of like them and their descendants and the people who will come after them? Because to kind of go with James' question, like if it's very difficult, which is clear, to try and figure out what the past was doing, if they have some sense of pleasing to the people around them and to humanity as a whole, can't we then sort of figure out whether they were like attempting to be, adding positive value to humanity as a whole, the people around them and all their descendants, versus not adding positive, outcomes to the people around them and their descendants? Like in that way, can't we kind of retroactively look back?
I think,
Or shouldn't we?
and maybe this was implicit in my answer to James also, that Hume is thinking that human societies on the whole are not in concord with each other, right? One thing that makes it hard is, like, if I ask, what if this is an example that Hume gives in the dialogues, or one of his characters gives in the dialogues concerning natural religion. There was this incident where Julius Caesar had to cross the sea, and there was a big storm, right? And the character is arguing against the view that that the reason God allows bad things to happen in the world is that God has to maintain strict regularities for our benefits. Like, we need these strict regularities to hold. So, and the character says, look, one wave a little bit higher would have capsized his boat and drowned him. Would anyone have ever known that there was an exception to the regularities, the laws of nature, right? Like, who can predict how high the wave is going to be? So why didn't God just give that wave a little push? Right? And the underlying assumption is not necessarily us, but that the people in that time would have been better off if the Republic had continued and not turned into the Empire, right? So, but on the other hand, if the Republic had continued and not turned into the Empire, what would have happened? Like, would the Germans have succeeded in invading Europe? And, and would the Angles have been able to invade Britain? And would, like, English-speaking people have colonized the New World, right? So, like, maybe someone who would have been good for the Roman society would have been bad for our ancestors. So, yes, I think that's the basic answer. But maybe Hume should say a little bit more about that, come to think of it. It's clear that this principle that we're pleased by people whose tendency to those around them is good is somehow based on the limits of our possible knowledge and attention, right? That we can't find character traits that reliably make someone beneficial to humanity as a whole. So, that problem is too difficult. But we can find character traits that makes someone reliably beneficial to the people we can understand their interactions with. But I mean, now I'm filling in something that Hume doesn't exactly say, but it seems to me like it's kind of Hume friendly, like it's the type of thing he would say. Does that?
Yeah, I know it's before the distinction between like the classic utilitarianism versus motives, but like, would you say that Hume just isn't really like he's not worried about or cognizant of like the motives of people? It's more like the actions that they then produce, because it seems that also like character seems to be. When we talk about like someone's affinity to be benevolent and all of these things, like, is that not kind of like an early concept of like one's motives and character in that way?
You're asking how this is related to utilitarianism? I mean,
And
it's
also eventually with Kant, because my wonder
yeah.
is just like when we take the example of Caesar, like, can we not say like, he had like the motive to be a good person and move society along, or say like, oh, he didn't have any motive to like be a good person and move the society along, and like judge the past in that way?
All right, I'm not sure at this point what you're asking is getting complicated. Whether we're wondering whether Caesar had a motive or so by motive you mean like his character
His
traits?
character.
Yeah. So yeah, like I said, Hume is in this book mostly focuses on characters rather than actions. We make moral judgments about both characters and actions. He's mostly focusing on characters, right? That's why he's talking about virtue and vice. I mean, virtuous actions presumably are, well, actually, I mean, there's different ways you can go with it. And what does Hume think? Does it mean actions prompted by virtue, or does it mean actions in accord with virtue? Because they might be different if you're mistaken, and so forth. But I think he thinks that problem is, however you answer that problem is both less important and harder to solve because he thinks for the most part, like, we care about the morality of actions mostly insofar as they give evidence of the character of the person who takes the action. And the reason we care about that for the most part is that, at least in most situations, it's more important to know like how this person can be expected to act in the future than it is to like focus on this one action, right? And like certainly if we feel this action is totally inconsistent with their character to the point where it starts to seem like they couldn't have done it voluntarily, then we no longer attach any moral praise or blame to it, right? We say they were insane or something like that. So I think, that's why he's focusing on character rather than action. And, but that's enough to show that although there's obviously mentioning social utility means that obviously there's some connection with utilitarianism. And obviously there's some historical connection with utilitarianism too, right? It's part of the same British tradition. But the topic we're talking about is different in some really complicated way, right? Like the utilitarian is imagining me deciding what to do, not caring about character at all, or at least only caring about character as a possible consequence of what I'm going to do, right? And then like starting to add up the utility on the two sides. Hume assumes the way I decide what to do for the most part is that I act the way my character determines me to. So what he wants to motivate is like to show why you should want to be virtuous, that is to have a virtuous character. that is, I mean, that is even in the end when he turns to recommending. So in a sense, you could say that at that point he's giving a real moral theory, because he's actually telling you what to do or advising you what to do, right? But it's still, it's not action by action. It's not a criterion for that. So yeah, so that before that, the subject is really different, right? Because before that, he's not recommending any action. He's just explaining what we actually approve of. All right. Yeah, sorry, I spent a long time on that, but it was a good question. Oh, do you have another question?
Well, just a brief response, also to maybe complicate Miles' question, specifically about like Julius Caesar. I mean, one complicating factor is, I mean, in my mind, it's not clear what virtues are considered beneficial or harmful. So like, if you read Shakespeare by Julius Caesar, it's like ambition. What is that? Is that positive or negative? Like you made in some different ways.
Well, but I mean, Hume has an explanation for that, right? Hume says the question of what things are really virtues is the question of what things are really socially useful. And those other things, right? Like immediately agreeable to the person themselves, useful to the person themselves, right? But I mean, again, those are actually important at least in the sense that a lot of things that classically are considered under the heading of virtue, Hume is going to place under those, right? Like, why do we approve of temperance? Because it's useful to the person who's temperate, whatever. All right, but let me get back to this. So, but I guess I'm going to try to go through it quickly so I can get to the rest of the stuff. Because like I said, well, I mean, the argument is pretty short, but it's like, it's difficult to assess. And it also, something that Hume admits in the progress of making it has weird implications. So the argument is that Hume says it's true, once virtue is in place, education can move our praise and blame away from what's natural, can increase it or decrease it, and can even create entirely new artificial virtues. But, you know, and so in the course of the argument, then what follows is, but it could never create these sentiments in the first place. So the question is, why not? I mean, there's two questions here. The one question is, okay, so if education can create virtues that are inconsistent with Hume's principles, then all of a sudden the induction that he's claiming to carry out is like more complicated, because there are going to be exceptions. And some of the exceptions seem pretty important. Like basically, everything that he calls superstition in this context, which means any kind of like ritual requirements or anything like that, right? Which most societies have. So the exception is very widespread, right? Because Hume says, yeah, these things are not useful usually. But it's artificially that, you know, we start artificially praising them as virtuous due to education. So I mean, that's but that's kind of the main question about this is, so why can education if it can create new virtues out of nothing, why can't it create the whole system to begin with? And what Hume says there, and as I was writing my notes, I was going back and forth whether these are, so what he says there is that the people wouldn't understand what the politician meant, right? When the politician tried to get them to approve of virtue because it's socially useful, or tried to get the politician, knowing that it's socially useful, tries to get people to approve of it. That's the way it goes, right? But social utility isn't the means of convincing them, because that won't work, because they don't already approve of socially useful, right? But the politician knows it's socially useful, and so is trying to convince them. So, like, the politician comes and says, you know, you really ought to praise people for doing X. Hume says the people won't understand what they mean. So, yeah, I think I was playing with two different answers, but I think they're really the same answer. The answer is, how does this work? Like, why won't they understand you? So what we're assuming is, I think, that before the politician comes along, what these people really approve of is what's good for them. And the politician comes and says, you should praise people for, and like, my first question is, wait, where are these people? What's their relation to me? And the politician says, no, it doesn't depend on that. Right? It's the same in all ages and all places. And I say, I understand, praising something is like expressing a certain relation it has to me. Right? Like, that's what the word means. That's what the thing is, right? Like, that's what praise is. I praise things means I think they're good for me. So that, like, the politician can't establish out of nowhere the idea that there's things that should be praised impersonally. Once that idea is on the table, then someone else can try to add to the list, right? Like, oh, you should also praise the monkish virtues of fasting and silence and whatever, right? But as long as I think praise and blame are like, it would be like if I came along and tried to convince you to that you should esteem a certain kind of thing distant. And you would be like, well, distant from what? And then I would say, no, it doesn't matter. It's the same in all ages and places. You'd be like, well, that's not distance. What are you talking about? Right? So I think that's the argument here. And it's, it calls attention to a feature of virtue that's going to be very important in the first part of section 9, that, praise for or blame for virtue is, Hume is going to say, it's like unique in being not relative to me and not confined to any neighborhood of me. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. There's more I could say, but I'm not going to, because I want to go on. Okay, so we have two arguments again. We have an argument against A and an argument against B, and an argument I think I never said what the argument is. The argument that the burden of proof should be on any alternative to C. Why is that? Well, because, as Hume says, so at first he says this in very strong terms, which are maybe, he would admit that this is a case where he's speaking as if he's certain when he really should be skeptical. But anyway, this is on page 43. Usefulness is only a tendency to a certain end, and it is a contradiction in terms that anything pleases as means to an end, where the end itself no wise affects us. So, right, I mean, in that case, the argument is not so much that it's burden of proof is on anything else, but that this absolutely must be a factor. If we always praise what's good for human beings, then what's good for if we always praise what's useful for human society, that is, what tends to make the people in the society happy or give them pleasure, then we must approve of the people in that society being happy and getting pleasure. Right? You can't you can't approve of the means to an end without approving of the end. I mean, it could be then that you could, as he admits, although he says he thinks it would be difficult, he doesn't think you're likely to succeed, but you could try to further go into human nature and resolve this approval. Right? So humanity basically means, again, being pleased with other people being pleased. So he says, you could try to explain that on the basis of some other more universal rules, but nevertheless, it would remain the case that this is something that pleases us, and that's the root of approval of virtue as socially useful. Right? So, I mean, is it really true that it's a contradiction in terms to say that we approve of the means to an end? And don't approve of the end? It would be irrational. Or anyway, it would seem to demand a further explanation, maybe in a way that this doesn't, right? Like you would have to say, well, it's true that this is the means to some end, but it doesn't please us because it's the means to that end. It pleases us for some other reason. Right. So anyway, I mean, I think at a minimum, this is supposed to show that, look, if Hume is right, that a big part of what we praise and blame is things that are socially useful or socially pernicious, respectively, then it certainly seems like the simplest explanation would be that we approve of things that are good for human societies. And not just our society. Right? That we're pleased just with the image of things that are useful to people. Even if they're not ours, even if they can't be ours, they're far away, they're imaginary, whatever. That would be the simplest explanation. Because then it's direct. Then of course we approve the means to that end. So, I mean, Hume also gives a bunch of positive arguments for C. I think I find that most of them, to me, are not very convincing. But that it may be something about the difference between my society and Hume's society. Right? when he talks about pastoral poetry, so I haven't really read any pastoral poetry, to tell you the truth. I don't think it's very popular now. It doesn't sound very good. It's like, right? It's like these long poems about shepherds and shepherdesses kind of cavorting in the fields, but it used to be very popular. And Hume says, people love it because it gives us this image of happiness and whatever. And then he mentions some poet who tried to transfer the scene to the seashore, to like fishers instead of shepherds. And he says it was widely considered to be a failure. And he says, then this is why, because the image of danger and toil and whatever that's involved in fishing is like makes it unpleasant. But it seems to me like we would probably agree, to the extent that we think about poetry, that poetry is probably better if it's about danger and toil, and right, than it's about like shepherds just kind of chilling in the fields. And but it's weird that we don't think very much about poetry, right? That's one of the strange things about our society. We don't have like famous poets, and we don't all argue about what the best poets are, and what that's really, and like I very much include myself in this. I'm not, I don't feel like I have very great sensitivity to poetry, but I know from reading history and philosophy that in most periods and times people have really been into poetry. So.
I would say that poetry is still very, very big in Europe. Like, growing up in my school curriculum, it was always like very poetry heavy, especially when like discussing history, and also like every single language arts class was based on poetry. And that goes for both like Romanian and Russian, like very poetry heavy over there.
But is it not just in school, but do people argue about it on the street? And
I would say everybody, yes, because everybody memorizes poems in school, and so they become like ingrained in everybody's mind.
right.
And so there is like discussion. Definitely like not as widespread as it like used to be maybe like a generation ago, but it's still very prevalent. Significantly more prevalent than it is in the US, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's just that we don't memorize a lot of poetry anymore. And maybe if I'd memorized poetry when I was younger, I would appreciate poetry better. A lot of our poetry doesn't exactly bear, like, one poet I was kind of into when I was younger was E.E. Cummings, but like, memorizing it would be like, you'd have to memorize the shape. So I don't know. Anyway, it's, I want to move on for this, but I just go back to what I, heaven's sakes. Someone's calling me and the ringer is off my phone, but now my computer is ringing. Oh, computer seems to have stopped ringing. It's still recording, though. All right. Yeah, I want to move on for this because we have to get to the other things. But I mean, as I said last time, it's possibly, it could be that our society is so strange that you shouldn't expect a good general theory of the origin of morals to apply to us. Which, if so, makes it hard for us to judge it. I don't know. But anyway, so I think that's all I want to say about Section 5. So now, this always happens. And when I say happens, I mean I always do this. It doesn't just happen. Right. But, because Section 5 is important, but Section 9 is more important, I think. Right, so again, the question in Section 9 is, the first part of Section 9 is, why does moral praise and blame tend to motivate us to try to be virtuous, right? Like, why do we, want this. Because well, maybe I raised section 5 too quickly, but so Hume argues from many examples that we do have this tendency to approve of things that are pleasant to other people and disapprove of things that are painful to them, all other things being equal. Right? Like if I have no interest in the matter at all, Hume says, then of course I'm going to decide on the side that's like good for the people who do have an interest in it. Or if I'm walking along the street and there's someone I don't know at all and they're sticking their gouty toes out into the street, so their toes are really painful, and I have to decide whether to step on their toes or step on the pavement, Hume says, well, of course, in that situation, I'm going to step on the pavement. Now, again, I'm not so sure that that's true now. That we can count on that. I mean, I wouldn't step on the gouty toes, but it seems like maybe there's a lot of people who would step on the gouty toes, and yet Hume can't imagine it. So have things really changed a lot? Maybe. I don't know. Anyway, but the point is, if I do have an interest in the matter, then this tendency might be very, very weak compared to that. Right? He allows on page 74 that the generous sentiments may be insufficient to move even a hand or finger of our body. It's a kind of approval you can feel for something that you're reading, a character that you're reading about in a book, and you're pleased that good things happen to the character in the book. But is that going to make you do anything? No, right? So if the author is if the author tries to bribe you to do something you don't want to do by promising to do something good for the character in the book, that's not going to work very well, right? You don't care that much. You care barely at all. It does please you, but so if that's all our moral approval and disapproval were based on, it seems like morality would be an extremely weak and mostly irrelevant consideration in human action. And again, although it's for sure not true that everyone is always motivated by morality, it seems like it has a lot bigger effect in human society than that. So Hume has to explain that. There's kind of two stages to the explanation, I think. The first stage is to explain why we isolate this particular type of approval and disapproval for consideration in the first place. And it has to do with communication. Right, so he compares it to, now wait, I was talking about this in an independent study last week, but I didn't talk about this in here yet, I don't think. He compares it to the words that we use for size. If I say this pen is smaller than this eraser, so if the eraser is here and the pen is here, then to me the pen is bigger. Whereas, like, if you're standing right here, to you, the eraser is bigger. So if we used words that referred to how big things are to us, they wouldn't be useful, right? So instead we develop these words that are corrected for point of view. And I mean, I say communication, but it's not just communication with others, but also with like our own future self, right? This includes self-communication, so to speak, right? Because first I do this and then I do this. So if I use those words, large and small, in the way that's always relative to the way things look right now, then things are constantly being changing their relative size in a way that's not useful for me for making plans for the future and whatever, right? Whereas if I learn to correct for it, then I learn by experience that corrected size stays the same, and I can rely on it staying the same, unless something happens, obviously, right, to change the object. So it's useful both for communication with each other and for like our own internal purposes to develop these corrected attributes. So Hume says the moral attributes are like that, right? If the only words we had for good and evil meant good for me, then when I told you something was good, that wouldn't be very interesting to you. And also, because what's good for me now might not be good for me later, it also wouldn't be necessarily useful for me even to use that word. So he says, that's why even if this tendency is slight, it's useful to develop a way of talking and thinking that isolates these things that we can agree on. So, I mean, that explains something, but it still doesn't go very far, right? Because even going back to the size example, for many purposes, perhaps for most of my purposes, what really makes a difference is how big something is to me, right? Like if I'm worried that I'm going to run into it, I don't want to know how big it would look at 10 paces or whatever. I want to focus on how big it looks right now, right? So, similarly, like if I'm trying to make sure that my view isn't going to be obstructed by something, I want to know how big it looks to me now, not how big it looks to me, right? So, similarly in this case, but again, if this humanity tendency maybe is quite weak, at least to begin with, I think he's going to try to explain how it can start out weak and get stronger, essentially. But if this humanity tendency is quite weak, then that's going to be even more true in the case of morality, right? It may be kind of interesting to talk to people using these attributes of praise and blame that we can agree on. But when it comes down to it, what I really want to know is the person good for me? Right, so the question is, what makes us not only praise virtue, give it our cool approbation, but what makes us be motivated by virtue, approve of it so strongly that we want to be virtuous, even if it sometimes seems to go against our self-interest. And Hume says, there's basically two reasons he gives. The first reason is basically mob feeling. Right? He says, like, we all know that if you're in the middle of a crowd of a whole bunch of people who are all enthusiastic about something, that, like, brings out the tendency in you as well, right? So, like, everyone strengthens each other. And he says, like, this is what we see in party conflicts or civil wars, that, people get more and more involved in their side because they're conscious of everyone else agreeing with them and being on their side, and their feelings get more and more stirred up. And he says, in the case of virtue, essentially what's happened is that all humankind together has become a party. Right? Like, even though it was weak, we notice that this is something that everyone around us, everywhere, approves of. And so we start to feel better and better about it, right? Like, we're like reinforcing each other. Like, so we're like, yay, virtue. Yeah.
Party means like political party, right?
Yeah, like a political party or like a faction within a city, which, I mean, basically is what a political party is, so to speak. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, that kind of party. Yeah, not like party down, no. So we all become the party of virtue. Right, it's on page 77. They form in a manner the party of humankind against vice or disorder, its common enemy. Right, so that explains why, just like when you're in a midst of an enthusiastic mob, you can do things that later on you might regret because they maybe were not really in your own best interests, because you get caught up in the enthusiasm of everyone. Similarly, when you're in the middle of this mob of all people everywhere, always, you can get caught up in the enthusiasm, and right. So, that's one answer, and the other answer is the love of fame. Right, this is on page 77. This is a motive that's very much emphasized by Hume's friend Adam Smith when he discusses morality. By our continual and earnest pursuit of a character, a name, a reputation in the world, we bring our own deportment and conduct frequently in review and consider how they appear in the eyes of those who approach and regard us. This constant habit of surveying ourselves, as it were, in reflection, keeps alive all the sentiments of right and wrong and begets in noble natures. But I think this is like the definition of noble natures, right? I mean, what made them noble? Begets in noble natures a certain reverence for themselves as well as others, which is the surest guardian of every virtue. So this is also, I mean, this is kind of a mistake, right? Like, call it noble if you want, but this is kind of a mistake. Like, I started off wanting to regulate my actions to make sure everyone else would approve of them. But somehow I got so caught up in that I forgot why I was doing it and started to identify with the others. So both of these motives, I mean, these are things that are socially useful. So from the point of view that we've already bought into virtue, we should think these are good, right? These are noble motives. But from a point of view of rational self-interest, which is, again, is the point of view he's going to take up in section 2 of part 2 of section 9, it seems like the right advice would be like, hey, step back. You know, like the advice you would give someone who is caught up in a mob. Wait, remember where you are. You know, right? So, in other words, it seems like, and I think this is, I think this is what leads, even though Hume doesn't really make this connection explicit, and I think this is what leads to the transition to part two, because the moral of this all seems to be that once you understand why we're motivated by virtue, the motivation is going to be weakened. You're going to realize it was a mistake. And you're going to do your best to work against it. Right? Like, it might be hard because it's human nature to, to fall into these mistakes, but you're going to say, like, look, these mistakes are bad for me. Sure enough, if that were true, then Hume's publishing his system would be pernicious to society. It would be something that we would, as a society, would blame him for. And since he does desire fame, that should worry him. So I think that's how we get back to recommending, right? No, I shouldn't, because we're almost out of time. I was going to read the passage. Well, I'll read it from my notes. The ingenuity of your researches may be admired, but your systems will be detested, and mankind will agree, if they cannot refute them, to sink them at least in eternal silence and oblivion, right? Like, that's what he's worried about. At least that's what he says he's worried about, which just increases the worry, right? Because that seems like he's not worried because his view will be socially pernicious. He's worried because if it is socially pernicious, no one will want to read it. So, okay, nevertheless, the answer is really interesting. And I think I don't have time left to do it justice. But, I'll just say, so the answer, roughly speaking, is that self-interest depends on first choosing what it is you want. And that, for example, that it doesn't make any more sense to talk about a distinct conflict between self-interest and humanity than it does to make a conflict between self-interest and avarice, right? So, like, avarice induces me to, like, collect all this money and not spend it, to be a miser. Because I've decided what I want is money. And that's what I use money for. So when I get some, I lend it out at interest so I can get more money, right? So Hume says, okay, so like you could call the miser, you could say the miser is acting from self-interest. You could also say that the virtuous, benevolent, just person is acting from self-interest because what they want is to be morally virtuous, right? So the question is, like, if you could choose one of these, which would you choose? And he says, like, compared to all the other things that people want. Now, has he actually considered all the other things that people want? But he says, compared to the other things that people want, I guess I'd say, compared to the things that people usually think of under the heading of self-interest. Maybe that makes it a little bit more plausible. Money, sensual pleasure, et cetera, et cetera. Hume says, the life of benevolence is smoother and easier and more pleasant, and it's like, if you can be satisfied with this, you're better off. So it's a weird kind of answer because it's, because you can't really choose that. But I think, and this is the thing I wanted to say this year that as far as I can remember I never said before, that may partly be the point. And, because I probably can't find this now and I'm out of time, but one of the things he says is that people don't usually say that they're not virtuous because they don't want to be. They usually say they're not virtuous because they feel themselves not to be. Right? They say, I wish I were benevolent and just and whatever, but I'm just not. I don't have that feeling. And Hume also at the end, when he tries to answer someone who says, like, well, but couldn't I have a pleasing life by being just almost all the time, except in a few cases where I can get away with it? And Hume says, well, if that's the way you feel, you're right. You're not very virtuous. So, I mean, I think maybe the answer in the end is that this question about recommending virtue is a little bit misguided, because it doesn't come down to someone arguing, persuading you to do something. It's about sentiment, right? And all Hume can do is paint it in colors that make it seem attractive. And that might change your feeling, but an argument isn't going to work. All right, anyway, that's all and more than I have time for. So thank you, everyone, especially people who kept coming until the end of the course. And have a good summer.